What's up guys, it's Nick here, and today I want to make a quick video just to discuss deuterium. So we had a conversation in our Facebook group Circadian Warriors where we were asking who did any hacks in order to deplete their deuterium levels, and a lot of people turned out not actually knowing what deuterium was. So I thought I'd make a quick video just to cover it and then give a bit of background information and then some of the ways in which you can lower your deuterium levels. So what we're going to be covering today, firstly we'll go into what is deuterium, just some basic science behind it. Then we're going to discuss some of the mechanisms in which deuterium affects your health. And then we're going to also go into a bit of history and why deuterium levels tend to be higher in our bodies these days than it would have been, say, 10,000 years ago. Then we're going to briefly touch on ways in which you can get your deuterium levels tested. And then some practical advice right at the end. We're going to have 5 key methods that you can use in order to lower your deuterium levels. So to start, just to give some basic chemistry, what deuterium is. Deuterium is an isotope. So what that means is, if you think of a hydrogen molecule, I'm sure everyone's familiar with hydrogen. What most people don't know is that there's actually different variations of hydrogen, which can differ a little bit in their molecular structure, even though it's still classified as hydrogen. So the main one that everyone knows there, you can see hydrogen, which has got 1 proton, and then it's got 1 electron in its orbit around it. And then you can see the second one, that's called deuterium. That's another version of hydrogen, and that one's got an extra neutron. So what that basically means is that it behaves like hydrogen, except that it has a heavier molecular weight. And then the third one over there, you can see tritium. That one doesn't really exist. It's the radioactive version of hydrogen, so we're not really going to touch on that today. But all you need to know is that there's different versions of hydrogen, and different versions can have different molecular weights. And we're going to discuss why that might be a problem now. Before we do go any further though, I'm going to, we're going to get into some really cool reasons why depleting your deuterium can be good for you. Better cognition, better muscle recovery, things like that. But I also want to emphasize that this is also being studied in the medical field. So, there's studies that cover a range of benefits, including decreased cancer cell growth and tumor suppression, increased stem cell activity, and even improved liver and kidney function. So Luke Story, who's the voice behind the Lifestylist podcast, he's quoted as saying that deuterium depletion is the most powerful health hack that you've never heard of. So now let's quickly touch on some of the mechanisms of how deuterium affects our health. And it's going to be really simple stuff, but basically, just in case you don't know, for those who aren't familiar, your mitochondria is basically the powerhouse of your cell, and it generates ATP or energy for whichever cell that it's in. So a good analogy to think of is that the mitochondria is like the engine to the car. So it provides the source of power and movement in whichever specific cell that it's in. So how this comes into play with different hydrogen molecules, and this is where you're going to see why deuterium can be so important literally on a cellular level, is because the way that the mitochondria generates ATP or energy is by taking hydrogen molecules from the extracellular matrix and using this as like a gradient pump and bringing them in, and that basically spins this motor in the membrane, which generates ATP. Now, if you think about this, if you're having a heavier version of hydrogen, such as deuterium, then what you're going to find is that it's not spinning as quickly and it's not generating as much energy. So that's basically why having high levels of deuterium can be detrimental to your health, is because in every mitochondria, if you have a lot of deuterium, then the chances are that the mitochondria is not going to be functioning properly, because it's not going to be able to spin as fast as it should and generate as much energy as required for optimal health. So some of the other benefits that are associated with decreasing your deuterium include better cognition, improved energy levels, enhanced athletic performance and recovery, increased metabolic rate, as well as disease prevention. So before we touch on the practical advice, just want to quickly tell you why you might want to, or why our deuterium levels may be higher now than they used to be, maybe say like 11,000 years ago. So the first kind of reason is, 11,000 years ago we hit the peak of the Ice Age, and since then our climate has been getting warmer. And what this means is that more glaciers have been melting, and this has basically led to a 30% increase in deuterium levels of our water. Now, deuterium actually freezes at a higher temperature than normal hydrogen. So it's at 3.8 degrees Celsius versus 0 degrees Celsius for normal hydrogen. And on that point, there's a couple people out there who think or say that you can hack your water at home by taking like a big drum of water and then freezing it, just partially freezing it, and then pouring out that water and keeping that water. And then, the water that is left would be deuterium, which makes sense theoretically. But from what I've seen online, there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that this actually changes the deuterium level of the water. So it is good to understand the science behind it, but that may not be one of the methods that you can use in order to deplete your deuterium. A lot of the studies do tend to use specifically deuterium depleted water, which is really helpful if it is accessible to you. It does tend to be quite expensive, so we're going to get into some of the ways, and it's not actually that hard. You probably are doing some things already in order to lower your deuterium levels, but this will probably just add a bit more clarity. One of the other ways, one of the reasons that we have higher deuterium levels is because the food that is grown these days doesn't tend to have, we don't tend to use a high quality of water. That means that the food itself is going to have higher levels of deuterium in it. A lot of animal foods are now fed with things such as grain, where there should be grass, such as your beef, with grain-fed versus grass-fed, and this then changes the amount of deuterium in that meat, especially in the fat, and we'll discuss that in a second. Just the last thing, so if you do want to get yourself tested for deuterium levels, then there's a really cool website you can go onto. It's called the Center for Deuterium Depletion, and they have a test. It's called a determinator, and basically they'll mail you 2 little swabs and sample things that you can, so you do a breath test as well as a saliva test, and you send that back to the lab, and using those 2 measures they can tell your deuterium levels in your body. So 5 methods which you can use in order to deplete your deuterium. And you don't have to go and get your deuterium levels tested. For most people, it's not a bad idea to look into lowering your deuterium levels. As I already said, it does tend to be quite high just because the standard level of deuterium in water these days and food is a bit higher than it used to be in the past. So the first one, this is the obvious one, and that is to change the source of your water. So as I mentioned, you can get deuterium depleted water. 2 of the brands that I know of are Preventer and Clarivia. Those are both really good ones. They do tend to be quite expensive. Also means you've got to bring them in plastic bottles when you do import them. So there's pros and cons to that. But if you are looking for just a good quality water in your area, your number 1 choice is high altitude spring water. So what happens is the higher the altitude, especially in like your glacial areas, the water there tends to be very low in deuterium. So if you can get water from those areas, then you're going to be getting water with a lower deuterium content. And you want to avoid tap water. That's going to be the worst source that's going to have the highest level of deuterium, obviously depending on where you are in the world. But if that isn't available, if the spring water isn't available to you, then you can use reverse osmosis water. That would probably be the second best choice. But what you probably will just want to do is remineralize that, because reverse osmosis, the process, does tend to remove the minerals in the process of making the water clean. The second step you can do is to follow a ketogenic diet. So this is actually why a lot of people say the ketogenic diet is so good and makes you feel so good, is because it is able to deplete your deuterium. One of the reasons for that is that when your body breaks down fat, it produces metabolic water, which is very low in deuterium. So for every kilogram of fat that your body metabolizes, it actually produces 1.2 liters of water. And your animal fats are going to be the best sources there. Plants, you can still eat things like green leafy vegetables, but what's very interesting is plants tend to also not want to store deuterium in their bodies. What they do is they push the deuterium in their, within their roots and through the stems into the fruits. So fruits tend to be one of those things that are quite high in deuterium. If you are going to be eating meat, obviously you want to pay attention to the quality of the meat. So grass-fed is definitely going to be better than grain-fed, because the fat quality that we mentioned earlier is going to have a higher level of deuterium for you to break down and produce more of this metabolic water. The third thing that you can look into is red light therapy. So the red light frequencies actually resonate with the hydrogen molecules in your mitochondria, and this basically lowers the viscosity of the fluid within your mitochondria, which means it's going to perform better. So if your mitochondria is performing better, you're going to basically have like a double effect here. You're improving the function of the mitochondria, so it's going to be spinning better and it's going to be producing more metabolic water, which is going to be low in deuterium, which means you're going to then improve the functioning of your mitochondria again, because now you're producing more and more hydrogen molecules of a higher quality as the process gets more efficient. Fourth thing that you can look into is fasting. So when you fast, especially if you're doing something like a dry fast, obviously that's not for someone who's a beginner, but if you have done fasting for a while, basically what you do is you force your body to tap into its endogenous or internal stores of water. So that's also going to be increasing your fat breakdown. So for those of you who are interested in maybe a bit of fat loss, that's going to help. But obviously there's more to that. I mean, everyone who does fasting notices almost immediately that you get a very high level of alertness and your cognition goes up, especially when you're fasting. And a lot of that is to do with your body's breaking down a lot of fat and then producing this really high quality water. The fifth thing that you can not do, or the thing you should stop doing, is taking supplements. So in the production of a lot of artificial supplements, they need to use water, and they tend to use a hydrogen. In order to make this water, they use a hydrogen gas that is very high in deuterium. So when for deuterium is slightly heavier, so obviously it sinks to the bottom. So it is a cheaper source of gas, and 99% of supplements, unless you're finding a specific supplement brand that specifies that they're using a better quality hydrogen, you can bet that they're going to be using a poor quality of hydrogen, and your supplement is likely going to be higher in deuterium. So that brings us to the end of the deuterium video. I hope that you guys got a lot of value out of this, and if you have any questions, you're welcome to send them through to me. If you found value from this and you found it interesting, then be sure to head over to Mitochondria and subscribe to our email list. And then also we've got a Facebook group called Circadian Warriors, and in there we regularly have videos and discussions around topics like these, especially about light and how it affects our health. I hope that you guys enjoyed the video. Take care. Cheers.